Hi there, and welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a widow, a woman dressed in mourning, and a smile far too calm for the tragedy she'd endured. Her husband had died suddenly, leaving her fortune, freedom, and unanswered questions. But when a man claiming to be her first husband returns from the dead, the whispers begin, whispers that reach the ears of Hercule Poirot. Two husbands, one woman, and a story where every vow was a lie, except the one that ended in murder. As Poirot delves deeper, he discovers a web spun from love, greed, and a secret that was never buried deep enough. Stay with us till the end. And if you love mysteries where truth walks hand in hand with deceit, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Man Who Came Back from the Dead. The storm had rolled over London without warning, blackening the afternoon sky and drowning the city in a curtain of cold, endless rain. It was the kind of evening when the world seemed to hold its breath. Inside the drawing room of the Halston residence, the clock ticked faintly, slow, measured, and deliberate, as if marking time for something dreadful about to unfold. Margaret Halston sat by the window, staring at the road beyond the iron gates. The widow had worn mourning black for almost 3 years now, but the fabric no longer looked new. Her husband, Richard Halston, had been declared dead after a shipwreck off the coast of South Africa. No body had been recovered, only his personal effects, a gold watch, a torn passport, and a letter addressed to her. Since then, Margaret had lived quietly in her grand home, attended by her maid and her grief. That night, however, her quiet world was about to crack open. The clock struck 7. A car pulled up to the gate. Her maid, Alice, entered the room. "Madam, there's a gentleman outside. He insists he knows you." Margaret turned slowly. "His name?" Alice hesitated. "He said, Richard Halston, ma'am." For a moment, the widow could only stare. The air thickened. Her breath caught in her chest. Then, as if in a trance, she stood and moved to the door. The man who entered the drawing room was soaked from the rain, but unmistakably alive. He looked older, his hair streaked with gray, but his face, his eyes, his voice. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's me." The teacup in her hand slipped and shattered against the floor. Word of the miraculous return spread through the district by morning. The newspapers called it the resurrection of the Halston heir. Friends came to the mansion, stunned and curious. Some whispered that it was a miracle. Others muttered about impostors and fraud. But for Margaret, the only truth that mattered was this: her husband was alive. Or so it seemed. 3 days later, a letter arrived at Scotland Yard. It bore no return address, only a few words written in neat, deliberate script. "The man claiming to be Richard Halston is not who he says he is. Please consult Mr. Hercule Poirot before it's too late." Detective Chief Inspector Arthur Graves read the letter twice, frowning deeply. He'd worked with Poirot before, the Belgian detective with an almost unnatural sense for lies and secrets. But now, Poirot was retired, or so the paper said. Still, Graves sent a message to a modest house in Whitehaven Mansions requesting assistance. And when Poirot, tidy, composed, and methodical, arrived the next morning, he accepted the case without hesitation. He didn't do it for Scotland Yard. He did it because the situation fascinated him. By the time Poirot entered the Halston mansion, the rain had returned. The house stood silent, every corner smelling faintly of age and secrets. Margaret greeted him at the door. Her composure was graceful, but her hands trembled as she poured him tea. "Mr. Poirot, I know how it sounds, but my husband is alive. I can feel it. I know him." Poirot nodded gently. "Then we shall prove it, Mrs. Halston. Either way, we will find the truth." Her husband entered moments later. He smiled at Poirot, confident but uneasy. "I suppose you're here to confirm my identity," he said. "I don't blame you." Poirot studied him carefully. Every word, every movement seemed deliberate, controlled. But behind the man's eyes, there was something strange. Not fear, not guilt, something else entirely. "Tell me," Poirot said quietly, "what do you remember about your last night before the shipwreck?" The man's jaw tightened. "The engines failed. There was fire. I jumped into the water and drifted for hours. A fishing crew found me days later. When I recovered, I sent letters, but none reached England." Poirot listened, silent. "You had a distinctive scar on your left shoulder, did you not? From a riding accident when you were 20. The man smiled faintly. "Still there." He rolled back his shirt sleeve. The scar was visible, faded but present. Margaret gasped softly. "That's his mark. Only Richard had that scar." Poirot inclined his head slightly, but said nothing. His eyes flicked to the man's shoes, the stitching, the faint tan lines on his hands, details that spoke of a life not quite matching the story told. When he left the mansion that evening, Poirot did not look satisfied. He stood beneath his umbrella, watching the dim glow of the house windows against the rain. "An extraordinary case," he murmured. "A man returns from the dead, but which death belongs to him?" 2 weeks passed. London's gossip columns feasted on the Halston miracle. The couple appeared together at charity events and in photographs. Yet beneath the surface, tension rippled like an unseen current. Margaret grew pale and restless. She began locking her bedroom door at night. Servants whispered that she often woke screaming, calling out her husband's name. One morning, Inspector Graves arrived at Poirot's flat with a grim expression. "You were right. Something's wrong with that man." He laid a small envelope on the table. Inside was a fingerprint analysis, one taken from Richard Halston's military records and one from the man now living in the mansion. They did not match. Poirot's gaze hardened. "Then we have an imposter, but not an ordinary one." "Whoever he is," said Graves, "he fooled everyone, even her." Poirot tapped a finger on the table. "No, not everyone. The widow suspects, deep down. She sees the man's eyes at night and feels the difference. That is why she wrote to us." Graves blinked. "She wrote the letter?" Poirot nodded. The handwriting, the phrasing, unmistakably hers. That evening, Poirot returned to the mansion under the pretense of reviewing documents for legal identification. But his true purpose lay elsewhere. He found Margaret alone in the library, staring at a fire that seemed too small for the size of the room. "I knew," she whispered before he could speak. "I knew it wasn't him. The way he holds his glass, the way he speaks. Richard never used to call me dear. He called me Maggie." Her voice broke. Poirot's tone softened. "Then why do you keep him here?" She looked up, eyes wet. "Because he knows things only Richard could know. Secrets no one else ever heard." Poirot leaned closer. "Or things someone else might have told him." She looked away. "He said if I told anyone, he'd make sure I regretted it." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Then we must be very careful, Mrs. Halston. You are not living with your husband. You are living with a man who believes he can take his place." The next morning, the imposter vanished. No one saw him leave. His clothes, his papers, his ring, all gone. Only a single item remained. The gold watch recovered from the original shipwreck, left deliberately on the nightstand beside Margaret's bed. Poirot examined the watch carefully. Inside the casing, faintly scratched into the metal, were words that had not been noticed before. "To M.H. Forgive me." Poirot closed the watch slowly. His mind was already racing ahead, beyond the mansion, beyond London. Somewhere, someone else had helped create this illusion. Someone who wanted the world to believe Richard Halston had returned. That evening, as lightning flashed across the city skyline, Poirot stood once more at the mansion gates. Rain ran down his coat in rivers and thunder rolled above. "The widow's 2 husbands," he said quietly. "One lost to the sea, the other born from deception. But which one is truly dead?" He turned toward the lights of the house, the rain whispering like voices around him. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "the masquerade ends." Chapter 2. The Man Who Wore Another's Face. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the kind of day when the air itself seemed to shiver. Margaret Halston sat alone at the breakfast table, the untouched tea before her long since gone cold. The seat across from her was empty, as it had been since the night before. No one knew where the man who claimed to be her husband had gone. Not the servants, not the police, not even Poirot. He had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. The newspapers called it the second disappearance of Richard Halston. But to Poirot, it was something else entirely. It was the second act of a performance, one staged by a mind both cunning and desperate. He arrived at the Halston mansion just after 10, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. The air inside smelled faintly of damp wood and fading perfume. Margaret looked up from her chair, her face pale and drawn. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked. Poirot gave a single nod. "I've found threads. They lead in several directions. But all of them begin with your husband's death." She swallowed. "I told you everything I know." "Perhaps," he said softly, "but sometimes the truth hides behind what we believe to be grief." He placed a small, leather-bound notebook on the table. "This was recovered from your husband's study in a locked drawer." Her eyes widened. "I thought the police took everything years ago." "They took what was visible," Poirot said, "not what was meant to remain unseen." He opened the book. Inside were notes, dates, numbers, initials, and a series of coded messages. One page was torn out, leaving only a jagged edge. At the bottom of the remaining page, written faintly in pencil, was a single phrase: "The ledger must never surface." Margaret stared at it. "I don't know what that means." "I believe you," Poirot said, "but someone else does." Later that day, Poirot visited Inspector Graves at Scotland Yard. The inspector's office was a maze of papers and cigar smoke. "Any word on our missing man?" Poirot asked. "Nothing," Graves replied. "No sightings, no stolen vehicles, nothing. It's like he disappeared in a thin air." Poirot nodded slowly. "Not thin air, my friend. He had help, someone who wanted him gone before I found out who he was." "Graves froneth. You think there's an accomplice?" "Oh, yes. The kind who knows where every truth is buried." That night, Poirot returned home, his mind alive with thought. He placed the notebook on his desk and began cross-referencing the dates with public records. One detail caught his attention: a large insurance payout made shortly after Richard Halston's declared death, not to Margaret, but to a private account in Geneva under a different name. Poirot leaned back in his chair. Now we see the shape of it. He rose, put on his coat, and made his way to the London docks, to a tavern called the Lantern's Rest, a place where sailors and drifters gathered to trade stories and secrets. He had arranged to meet a man who had worked aboard the same vessel that sank years ago, a ship called the Valiant Star. The man's name was Thomas Cray, and he looked as though he'd spent his life at sea. His eyes were watery and his hands rough. "Halston," Cray said when Poirot asked. I remember him. Kept to himself mostly. Rich sort, didn't belong among the rest of us. But there was another man, too, looked just like him. I thought they were brothers." Poirot leaned forward. "Another man?" Cray nodded. "Joined the crew last minute. Said his name was Henry Ward. Didn't talk much, but when the storm hit, I saw them arguing on deck. The waves were crashing, the ship was breaking apart, and I swear, one of them pushed the other." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You're certain?" "As certain as a man can be before a ship goes down." When Poirot returned to his flat that evening, the pieces were falling into place. Two men aboard the same doomed ship, one wealthy, one unknown, both sharing a remarkable resemblance. One died, one survived. But which one? He needed proof. The next morning, he asked Inspector Graves to obtain the surviving passenger lists and photographs from the voyage. It took hours, but by afternoon, Graves returned with a faded record. Only 22 names were listed. Among them, Richard Halston and Henry Ward. Graves Fronith. No pictures, unfortunately. Poirot didn't reply. He was staring at the name Henry Ward as though it were whispering something only he could hear. Find everything you can on him, Poirot said. Bank records, family, birthplace, everything. By dusk, Graves returned, holding a single file. There's barely anything. No family. No fixed address. But he worked at a law firm once, as a clerk. The same firm that handled Richard Halston's estate after his death. Poirot's face darkened. Then the impostor was not random. He was chosen. Prepared. Back at the Halston mansion, Margaret stood in the dim light of her husband's study, the sound of rain drumming softly against the windows. The gold watch still lay on the desk, gleaming faintly. She picked it up and turned it over in her hand, staring at the inscription inside. Tum. H. Forgive me. Forgive me. For what? A sudden noise broke the silence. A faint click from behind the wall. She froze. Then slowly, she followed the sound to the large bookcase at the end of the room. One of the shelves was slightly ajar. Her hands trembling, she pushed. The shelf swung open, revealing a narrow space behind it, a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small metal box. She lifted it out, heart racing, and opened it. Inside were photographs, letters, and a small black ledger, the very thing her husband had written about. The ledger was filled with names, dates, and transactions, all connected to an elaborate smuggling ring that had been operating through London's shipping lines. Margaret stared at it, horrified. Her husband hadn't been a victim. He'd been part of something criminal, something vast, and someone had killed to keep it hidden. Mrs. Halston. She spun around, nearly dropping the box. It was Poirot, standing in the doorway. He had arrived quietly, as though expecting to find her there. I see you have found what he meant to hide, he said softly. Her eyes filled with tears. My husband, he wasn't who I thought he was. Poirot approached, his gaze kind but firm. No, madame, but you are not the only one deceived. Someone else has been using his name to continue his work. And that man, the one who lived in this house, was his accomplice. Margaret's hands shook. Then who killed Richard? Poirot paused. That is the question, is it not? The following day, Poirot arranged a private meeting at his flat. Inspector Graves was there, along with a lawyer named Mr. Collins, the same man who had handled Halston's estate. When Collins entered, his expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed something sharper. Mr. Poirot, he said, you asked to see me? Poirot gestured for him to sit. Yes, Mr. Collins. I wanted to ask about a former employee of yours, a man named Henry Ward. Collins froze. Henry? Yes, he worked here years ago. Clever man, but troubled. Left suddenly after the Halston case, as a matter of fact. Poirot tilted his head. You seem surprised that I would ask about him. Surprised? Collins forced a laugh. He's been dead for years. Poirot smiled faintly. Is that so? For a long moment, the room was silent. Then Poirot leaned forward, his eyes steady and unblinking. Mr. Collins, the man who claimed to be Richard Halston, he is not missing. He is dead. His body was found this morning in the river. Graves looked at Poirot sharply, but said nothing. He knew Poirot was bluffing, testing the man. Collins paled. That's terrible. Poirot's tone was calm. It is terrible, yes, but it is also revealing. You see, I never said how he died, and yet you looked guilty the moment I spoke. Collins stood abruptly. I think we're done here. Poirot's voice cut through the room like steel. Sit down, Mr. Collins. The lawyer hesitated, then sank slowly into his chair. You helped him, Poirot said softly. You created the false identity, forged the papers, coached him to imitate Richard Halston. And when he began to fear exposure, You helped him disappear." Collins's voice cracked. "You don't understand. He forced me. He said if I didn't help, he'd expose me too." "Expose you for what?" Poirot asked quietly. Collins buried his face in his hands. "The smuggling. The accounts. The money was supposed to be gone when Halston died. But when Ward found out, he wanted his share. Then he wanted more. He said he'd go to the widow, tell her everything." Poirot's eyes darkened. "So you silenced him." Collins looked up, tears in his eyes. "It wasn't supposed to happen. We argued near the river. He slipped. I didn't mean to." Poirot's expression did not change. "Yet he fell, and you walked away." When Poirot left Scotland Yard that evening, the rain had stopped. The air was cold and clean, the streets quiet beneath the gaslight. He thought of Margaret Halston, of the widow who had mourned a man who betrayed her and then feared another who pretended to love her. Two husbands, both liars, one by crime, the other by choice. At the mansion, Margaret stood at the doorway when Poirot arrived. She didn't ask for details. She simply looked at him, her eyes hollow. "It's over," she whispered. "It is," Poirot said softly. "But peace will take time." She nodded slowly. "I suppose the truth always costs something." Poirot glanced at the dark sky. "Yes, madam, and it is the one debt that must always be paid." As he left the Halston estate for the last time, Poirot paused by the gates, watching the lights fade behind him. "The widow's two husbands," he murmured. "One real, one false. And both gone, leaving behind only the truth they feared most." He walked on, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the night like the ticking of an unseen clock. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this case was not quite finished. The dead had a way of returning, and sometimes they came back with vengeance. Chapter 3: The Widow's Final Confession. The following days passed with a silence that hung heavy over London. The newspapers printed the story in their usual sensational fashion. The widow's two husbands. The case that shocked Mayfair. There were photographs of the Halston mansion, interviews with neighbors, and endless speculation about how the whole affair had begun. But while the public moved on quickly to the next scandal, for those who had lived it, the wounds ran far deeper. Margaret Halston had withdrawn entirely from the world. Curtains stayed drawn, the house stood quiet, and she refused visitors. Yet in the stillness of that great, echoing home, secrets still whispered, faintly, like echoes that refused to die. Poirot knew there was something unfinished. He could feel it, as surely as one feels the weight of an unanswered question pressing on the mind. It was a cold, clear morning when Inspector Graves arrived at Poirot's flat with a grim expression. "We've closed the case officially," Graves said, removing his hat. "Collins will face trial. The impostor's real name was Henry Ward, as you suspected. It's all tied up neatly." Poirot looked up from his desk. "Neatly, you say? Ah, my friend, neatness is a dangerous illusion. A room may look spotless, yet dust hides where the eye does not go. Gravis froneth. You think something's still missing?" Poirot nodded. "The heart of it. The reason." He rose, taking from his desk a photograph, the one recovered from the secret ledger box. It showed Richard Halston standing beside a small aircraft, his arm around another man. Both were smiling. The other man was Henry Ward. Poirot tapped the photo lightly. This was not the relationship of strangers. It was a partnership, perhaps more than that. Graves leaned closer. "You think they worked together?" Poirot nodded. Ward was his clerk. He helped hide the smuggling accounts. But why would he kill Halston on the ship? Why take his name? Unless... He trailed off, his eyes narrowing. Graves crossed his arms. "Unless what?" Poirot turned the photograph toward him. "Unless the true plan was to disappear. Together." Graves stared. "You mean Halston wanted to fake his own death?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Just so. And Ward was meant to help him. But something went wrong." By afternoon, Poirot was once again standing before the Halston mansion. The air felt strange, heavy, almost mournful. The front door opened before he could knock. Margaret stood there, pale and fragile, dressed all in gray. "Mr. Poirot," she said quietly, "I thought the case was closed." "For the world, yes," he said. "For me, not yet." She stepped aside. "Then come in." They walked to the drawing room. The fire burned low, shadows flickering against the walls. On the table sat a single envelope, sealed with black wax. "I was just about to send this," she said. "It's for you." Poirot took the envelope but did not open it. "Perhaps you can tell me what it contains." She looked away. "A confession." Poirot's voice softened. "Then you already know what I am about to say." She nodded faintly. "Richard planned to disappear. He told me about the smuggling, about the debts. He said it was the only way to start again. Henry Ward would help him vanish. They would share the insurance money." Poirot said nothing. He could hear the tremor in her voice. "But Henry betrayed him," she went on. "They fought on the ship. Henry survived, and when he came back, he used Richard's plan for himself. He came to me not because he loved me, but because he wanted the rest of the fortune." Poirot's eyes softened. "And yet, madam, you played along." She looked up sharply. "I had to. He said he'd tell the police that I helped Richard hide the money. He said I'd hang if I spoke. So I stayed silent. Until you came." Her hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. "I thought when Henry died, it would end. But it doesn't, does it? The truth never really ends." Poirot's tone was gentle. "No, Mrs. Halston. It only changes its face." Hours later, Poirot left the mansion and walked slowly through the fog-draped streets. But even as he replayed her words, something still troubled him. There was one piece of the puzzle that refused to fit, the letter left inside the gold watch. To H, forgive me. Those words had not been written by Henry Ward. The handwriting belonged to Richard Halston himself. Poirot stopped mid-step. "Forgive me. Why would Halston write that if he intended to escape? Unless he knew what was coming." He turned and went back to the mansion. The house was quiet when he entered again. Too quiet. The air was still, almost suffocating. Poirot moved quickly through the corridor, the echo of his footsteps the only sound. He found Margaret in the study, seated beside the fireplace. The gold watch lay open in her hand. The letter he had given her earlier was now opened and spread across the table. Her confession, signed and complete. "Mrs. Halston," Poirot said softly, "I must ask you one more question." She looked up slowly. "Yes. The night your husband left for South Africa, did you see him board the ship?" Her eyes flickered. "Yes. I saw him from the car." Poirot shook his head gently. "No, madame, you did not, because Richard Halston never reached the ship." She froze. "What are you saying?" He stepped closer. "Henry Ward boarded that night, but he was not alone. Richard was already dead. He died here in this house." Her face went pale. "No." Poirot's gaze was calm but unyielding. The letter inside the watch was not a message of farewell. It was an apology. He was writing to you before the struggle, before the end. Margaret's eyes glistened. "You can't prove that." Poirot gestured to the fireplace. "When your husband died, Ward helped you. Together, you disposed of the body. Then, with his help, you built the story of the shipwreck. You collected the insurance. And when he returned years later, pretending to be Richard, you feared him because he held your secret." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't mean to. It was an accident. Richard was drunk. He hit me, and I pushed him. He fell. The fire poker struck his head. There was so much blood." Her voice broke. "Henry helped me bury him in the garden. I thought it was over." Poirot's voice was quiet. "But guilt has roots, madam. It grows beneath the surface until one day it breaks through." She began to cry, the sound soft and trembling. "When Henry came back, I thought it was him, that Richard had somehow survived. When I realized who he was, I wanted to believe it could all end peacefully. But I was wrong." Poirot nodded slowly. You were wrong to think you could live without the truth. He reached forward, gently closing the watch in her hand. It is time to tell the world what truly happened. That evening, as the police arrived and the garden was dug up, the truth was uncovered, quite literally. Beneath the old oak tree near the edge of the property lay the remains of Richard Halston, buried for 3 long years beneath the soil he once owned. The watch found with the body matched the inscription. The truth could no longer be hidden. Margaret Halston did not resist arrest. She only said, quietly, "Tell them I loved him once." That's all. A week later, Poirot sat in his study, sunlight spilling gently through the window. On the table lay the newspaper headline, "The Widow's Confession, Truth Behind the Halston Mystery." Inspector Graves entered, shaking his head. "I'll never understand it. 2 men dead, 1 woman ruined. And for what? Money." Poirot smiled faintly. "Not money, my friend. Guilt. It is a far heavier currency. Grave saith. You think she'll hang?" Poirot looked down. "The court may judge her, but I think she has already judged herself." They sat in silence for a long time. The clock ticked softly, marking the passing of something unspoken, an ending, perhaps, or simply another beginning. Finally, Graves rose. "You ever tire of all this, Poirot? The death, the lies?" Poirot smiled gently. "Ah, mon ami." He stopped himself, remembering not to use the phrase. "My friend, truth has a voice that must be heard. I am merely the one who listens." That night, alone in his flat, Poirot opened the gold watch one final time. The engraving inside caught the lamplight to M.H. "Forgive me," he whispered quietly. And so she did, perhaps, in her own way. He closed the watch, placed it in a small box, and set it beside his files. Another mystery solved, another soul laid bare. And somewhere, beyond the rain-streaked window, the city slept, unaware of how close darkness often sits beside love. As the music fades and the lights dim, the mystery of the widow's 2 husbands closes, but the secrets of the human heart remain endless. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of deception, suspense, and the brilliance of Hercule Poirot, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps uncover the next great mystery. And remember, every truth leaves a shadow.